Uh, Poini ma'am, it's around 4 o'clock now. Shall we just get started or wait for another couple of minutes?
No, I think we get started. We already have about 50 odd people. While people are joining, we can get started. Yeah. So good afternoon, all and everyone. I welcome you on behalf of SIGN. Many of you may already be attending our webinars or knowing about SIGN in general, but still in nutshell, we are a business incubator at IIT Bombay, provide start to scale up support to innovators and entrepreneurs. We are also building our vertical strength in biomedtech areas and supported by BIREC, which is under Department of Biotechnology, Government of India. Towards the end of the session, my colleague Pranita will share more details about various funding opportunities and other support programs for biomedtech space. Now, coming to today's theme, which is regulation around clinical trial, we have a very distinguished speaker from a leading pharma company, Dr. Chirag Trivedi from Sanofi Pharma, who is also kind of an authority in this field. In fact, as a session, we would pretty much like to keep it more interactive. So the idea is that Dr. Chirag will talk at a high level about clinical trial, and then we will directly get into conversation mode. So please keep writing your questions and answers in this chat box, and we will facilitate interaction based on those questions. Before I hand it over to Dr. Chirag, a quick introduction about him. He has been with Sanofi since 2006, currently as a senior director and head of clinical study unit India and Southeast Asia cluster, which oversees clinical trial studies in India, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. The list is very long. Prior to Sanofi, Dr. Chirag worked with a CRO as well as a leading central lab. Dr. Chirag is also the president of Indian Society for Clinical Research since April 2017. The society brings together all those who are engaged in clinical research activities in India, and it provides a forum for exchange of information learning, and it also aims to build the awareness about clinical research as a specialty in India and facilitates its growth in the country while helping evolve highest industry standard of quality and ethics. Dr. Chirag carries a strong experience in the field of clinical research, clinical quality assurance, medical excellence, pharmacovigilance, bioavailability and bioequivalence studies, and business development. Dr. Chirag is a PhD in pharmacology, is a regular speaker in various national and international fora. So over to you, Dr. Chirag.
Thank you so much, Madam Bhatt, for your introduction. And at the outset, I want to thank SIGN IIT and Madam Bhatt, you, Mr. Sarthi, and Dr. Pranita for having me here. It is a pleasure to interact with people here, a topic which is very pertinent, a very topical topic, if I may say. Clinical trials today is almost a household word now. Everybody across the world has is knowing now what clinical trials are, and it is really a privilege for me to come and talk to you about this. Uh, I'm sharing my presentation. I hope you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. So, what I'm going to be talking about is just a bit of a primer on clinical research India. Why do we need it? What are the basic steps involved in clinical trials, and which will lead to either a drug or a vaccine registration or a medical device registration? So we will talk about that. And then more so, as was mentioned earlier, we will try to have a lot of interactions here. So I'll just keep it very brief in terms of my presentation. Just a disclaimer here, I'm speaking in a personal capacity here. So if I say something stupid, don't blame my company Sanofi for it and blame just me for it. I've taken some reference images from the internet, which are freely available, and I've of course quoted the sources as well. Now, I talked about this in a minute ago that clinical research has become almost a household name. And why is it so? The reason is very evident. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed all our lives, and probably this is an understatement that it has changed our lives. It has changed so many things for us. The industry got together to have a cure, maybe in terms of a drug or a preventive mechanism in terms of a vaccine, to get together. And if you see, we have done this with phenomenal speed. Within less than a year, there were companies, biopharmaceutical companies, which were able to come out with vaccines that have got some emergency use authorizations. And India also was not behind. We have many companies here which are currently doing vaccine research, and two of them have already received emergency use authorization from our own regulators. So clinical research are very, very pertinent. If you see the entire process from what when we start thinking about developing a molecule or a vaccine or a device candidate to the fruition, it takes a long, long time. But the pandemic was at an unprecedented scale. I think the word unprecedented must be the most used word of 2020 and probably continues to be in 2021 as well. So it was unprecedented. The scale of pandemic was unprecedented, and so were the scale of efforts. All people got together, the academics, the hospital, the medical institutes, biopharmaceutical companies. They were supported by various governments across the countries, because of which today we are able to see some hope. The processes were all fast tracked. No corners were cut, mind you. Let me be very clear, not even one corner was cut anywhere. While the processes were done faster, they were done parallelly and simultaneously. They were done in an innovative way, but they followed all the requisite guidelines and the regulations which were there for it. So obviously, the vaccine which are here today have some data on their efficacy as well as on the safety of the vaccine candidate. So that is the importance of clinical research that we have here. And this is not today. Clinical research, clinical trials have been the cornerstone of any drug development or vaccine development process since decades. The randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for proving the safety and efficacy of any new drug or vaccine or intervention that happens, and it has to be done. There are various phases of it, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the data generated from it is scrutinized thoroughly by the regulators of different countries, and if they are satisfied that the drug or the intervention is efficacious, is safe for the patient that will be used in their country, then only they give the approval. So basis the data generated from clinical trials, the drugs or the vaccines or the devices, they start getting used in the patients in the country, and that generates, so the evidence that we had accumulated from clinical trials starts getting translated into practice, which is real world information starts coming in, and that real world information then feeds back into the development of the product or the drug or so that's how the real world evidence comes into place, and it has a very important place now. And why do we need clinical trials in India? Let me tell you one thing. Whatever we hear and say about it, if you look at a global clinical trial registry, we just around 1.2% of the current global clinical studies registered across the world. So there's one global registry. There are close to 400,000 trials which are studies which are currently being ongoing, and of which only about 1.2% is being done in India. So we do have a lot of gap here, and why do I say we do have a gap? If you see, there's a lot of unmet medical need for our patients. On the right is the graph which is taken from the ICMR survey of the disease burden, the state level disease burden of our country. So they've compared the data from 1990 to 2016. If you see, there has been a shift in the pattern of diseases that we are seeing in terms of there were more of infectious diseases earlier in the decade of that 90 that we saw, whereas in 2016 the lifestyle diseases are getting prominent there on the top there. So and there are various reasons which are attributed to the rise of these non-communicable diseases. There's a faulty lifestyle, the food that we eat, the exercises that we don't do, sedentary lifestyle that we do, all those are contributing it. And if you see, there's a huge unmet medical need. We all know this. India is the second most populous nation in the world, and our disease burden is 1/5 of the global disease burden. So close to 20% disease burden is in India. So huge disease burden with a huge population, huge unmet medical need, and very little research being done in India. So there's a huge gap that we need to bridge, and that's what we're looking at. Now, if you look at what is the process for drug development, this is the traditional process that I may see, which is there for drug development. This was, of course, done earlier. And this is in the pre-COVID times. If you see, the timelines were there. There is a pre-discovery phase wherein a lot of computer simulations are being done in the labs, in the what we say computer-aided drug designing, and there are various models which are being built in there to see which is the best fit in terms of a molecule or an antibody or whatever to that particular target that we are aiming at in the human body. From which there are some compounds that are being screened, some thousands of compounds are being screened, and then in that case, from that we get into preclinical phase, and then we get into clinical phase. So preclinical is something which is being done in animals. The drug discovery phase is still in the lab. Preclinical is in the lab, and the animal data. That data, if it's proven to be safe, it's in the animal model. There's good data to go ahead. We enter into clinical trials, and then we come the phase 1, which is the first in human trials that we say. Then that's done in few number of volunteers. Generally, except for oncology, these are, and in diabetes, these are done in healthy human volunteers because we want to understand the safety. So the prime reason for doing a phase 1 is safety, to see if the molecule is safe. Then there are some other reasons also that we do it to understand the drug characteristics and the PK, PD, the drug-drug interactions, drug-food interactions, various kind of interactions that the drug may have with the body, and we study that. Once it is found to be safe in phase 1, we go to phase 2, divided into phase 2A, phase 2B, where we have those finding and those escalation studies that we do to find out which is the right dose in the targeted population. That means in that disease population that we are aiming to develop the drug or the vaccine for. We look at that, and it produces whether the response that we want or not. And then we go to a phase 3, which is in thousands of patients. So phase 2 typically could be 200, 300 or 400 sometimes patients. Phase 3 could be in hundreds or thousands. Like if you see in the vaccine phase here, vaccine development, sometimes phase 1 also you look at immunogenicity. So if you see many of these vaccine candidates, some of them had phase 1, 2 combined, or some of them had phase 2, 3 combined. So what we call is something called as adaptive design. As information started coming in, the vaccine candidates started moving from phase 1 to 2 or from phase 2 to 3. So these are adaptive design. That's how we were able to shorten the timeline. So all the phases were done, but as an adaptive design, the data was analyzed very quickly. As we all know, vaccine was developed for a global pandemic. So the sensitivity of having a treatment against this was very high amongst people. There were people who wanted to flock into hospitals, say, can I take part in the trial? And that's how the recruitment also got a big momentum, and we could recruit patients across the country, across the globe. Many vaccine candidates, they would have had data on 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 participants. So this is the large scale of data which was developed. So phase 1, 2, 3 was done, and they were followed up for a particular period of time, after which the data was submitted to the regulators, and then the regulators also reviewed it very, very quickly. Usually they would take a lot of time, but in this case, the reviews were done quickly, the approvals were given very quickly. And again, as I mentioned, there was no laxity in the review process. All the necessary review processes were followed. The scrutiny was very rigorous, but the timelines were significantly shortened. So that's how we were able to move into it. This is how a drug development usually would happen. Now, if you have to look at device, it's a bit of a different here, somewhat similar steps here, but there are differences when we look at the development pathway for a medical device. Now, of course, it starts right from the discovery and ideation of the device. You do the engineering, you invent it, do all those. So you develop your device, you validate it, see the design qualification, all that is done. You do the preclinical, which is there, the bench test and all, and after that you get into the clinical. So there is a design performance, and then there's the design validation. So design performance is to look at from an engineering perspective, is the device what you intended to be, and design validation is this the device what the customers want. Move from
Chirag, you are not audible.
Yeah, Dr. Chirag, I think we are facing some issues with connectivity. Dr. Chirag, you're not audible for us. I think there is some connectivity issue from Dr. Chirag Trivedi's side, but he'll probably join back in a minute or so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. And
Yeah,
the slides.
yeah, slides are visible now. Yeah.
Okay, and you can hear me well. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is where the devices development takes place. That's how it is. The data that you generate from the clinical investigations will be submitted to the regulatory authorities for them to decide, and then you can launch a product. And in both the cases, whether it's drugs, vaccines, or for medical devices, you will need to generate post-marketing data as well, because you need to know how the device or the drug or the vaccine is behaving once it is administered to the general patients or the general public at large. So post-marketing data collection is important. There are regulations surrounding it which we need to follow. And there are some on the slide here, if you see, there are some considerations which are given for design considerations of for the medical device for ensuring, I mean, for determining its safety as well as effectiveness. So there are different kind of tests which are being given here. Now, when we do clinical trials, there are a lot of things that we need to follow, and there are a lot of requirements that we will need to be fulfilling, because as we understand that clinical trials is a very serious thing. It is dealing with lives of people. Also, not only during clinical trials, but after the clinical trials, your drug or your vaccine or your device will be administered to patients across the world. So these stakes are very high. You need to be following standards which are there and requirements which are there, and that compliance is going to be the key. So important for us will be to know what all regulations exist, what all compliance, what all do I have to be compliant to, and have a lot of transparency. Because if you see in the vaccine, going back to the vaccine, I'm giving vaccine examples because that it is very topical nowadays and people all relate to it better. So that's why I'm giving vaccine examples here. That people are asking, oh, does it have phase 2 or phase 3 data? Is it safe? Do you think I should take it? And they are going back to data. So if there is no transparency in the data there, people may not accept your product, and that's going to be very risky. So obviously you need to be as transparent as required, because that data is going to be the key there. So all those things are going to be important for us when we do a clinical trial. Now, who are the key players in a clinical trial? Now, it could be you all as a sponsor. Sponsor means somebody who's going to fund it, somebody who's going to run the study, and then the regulators are involved, because obviously they look at the data. They will give you the approval for clinical trials. They will also, you have to give periodic updates to them. They will review the data of a clinical trial that you submit to them, so that if they have to approve a drug product or a vaccine or a device, they can do basis that review of data. And then there are investigators. Investigators are the doctors who conduct clinical trials. So these are the term is investigators, and they have team members in their hospital. Could be nurses, could be pharmacists, all of those people who are playing an active role there at the hospital sites, what we call. So the hospitals which conduct clinical trials, we call them as sites. So these are hospital sites. Then we have got a committee, what we call as ethics committee. These are, in a layman's term, these are patient advocates, if I may say. This is a committee. It has constituted per law. There are regulations that are defining the constitution and functioning of the committee. So there will be a physician expert, there will be a lawyer, there will be a social worker, there will be a philosopher or a theologian, there will be a lay person within the committee, there will be a clinical pharmacologist. So all those people are there to evaluate the ethics of the trial that you're going to do. That is this ethical for my patients at the hospital that you're looking at. So it's a committee you will need to have the approval of an ethics committee before you initiate a clinical trial. And of course, the front and center, I mean, at the heart of everything is the trial participants. So they also play a very important role, and that's why you need to be making sure that you are engaging with your patients or the trial participants to understand if they have any concerns, plow it back into your research and modify your research so that their safety, their rights, their well-being are always preserved. So these are some of the key players in clinical trial. Now you require certain approvals as well. So in India, we have to submit, no trial can begin without the approval of our regulators, what we call as DCGI, the Drugs Control General of India. So the application has to be made on an online portal that they have. Also, while we do take the DCGI approval, we also need to take the ethics committee approval. Now, each hospital will have their own ethics committee, which is registered with the DCGI. So a registered DCGI, a DCGI registered ethics committee is what will approve. So you will take the DCGI approval, you will take the ethics committee approval, and then only you can start a trial. So the DCGI approval is overarching for the entire trial for all your hospital sites that you want to do it. The ethics committee will be specific to a site. So you will need to take, suppose if you have 10 trial sites, 10 hospitals, you will need to take 10 ethics committee approvals. So this is how it goes. Now, just a bit of a specific on the medical devices. There are classifications, as probably some of you may know. There are these medical devices rules which came out in 2017, and they were applicable from 2018. And per that, the medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices have been classified depending on the risk category that they have. So if it's a low risk class A, the low and moderate risk class B, and then likewise moderate high risk class C, and high risk is class D. And similarly is the case for IVDs as well, in vitro diagnostic devices as well. Now, generally, except for class A, specific cases only in class A may require clinical investigations. Otherwise, class B, C, and D require clinical investigations. So class A will not, but then the regulators may tell you in case if they require to be having a clinical investigation data for class A, certain devices in class A. Also, if you are importing devices from say class B, C, D kind of device from or if the device is already approved in countries that they have specified, say UK, USA, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, in that case, you do not need to conduct a clinical investigation plan. So that needs to be approved in those countries there, and at least for 2 years. And in those 2 years, there has to be no adverse event reported because of the device there. In this case, they may waive off the requirement of a device trial for registration in India. You have to do a post-marketing trial in that case. So this is how the rules are for it. Now, what is the review and approval process for a clinical trial? So you prepare a clinical trial dossier. If you see in the there are new drug clinical trial rules, and there's this medical device rules. These rules specify what should the dossier contain when you want to submit a clinical trial for review and approval to the DCGI. So you compile all the required information per those rules, submit the dossier to the CDSCO in their online portal. In parallel, you can submit it to the ethics committees also. They are not dependent on each other. Again, mind well that you cannot begin the trial without the approval of both, but the application can be made in parallel. At the DCGI end, the clinical trial investigation plan will be reviewed by the subject expert committees, which is there. So this is a committee constituted by our regulators. This consists of physician experts of that therapeutic area. Suppose if you want to have any prosthesis, say for knee replacement, then probably it may be referred to the orthopedics committee, and there are orthopedics who are sitting as a part of that committee who will evaluate your clinical investigation plan or the protocol. So likewise, if it's for heart or whichever, that therapy area specific subject expert committee will review your clinical investigation plan, will review the data generated thus far, and basis that they may either approve your study or they may suggest modification, which you'll have to go back and submit that modification or the justification for not modifying per their suggestion. Once that committee has given their approval, DCGI will look at the recommendation of the committee, and after which they may or may not, generally they do consider the recommendation of the expert committee, and basis that the DCGI gives the approval for your trial so that you can begin the trial. And then you need to register the trial in a public registry. What we have in India is the Clinical Trial Registry of India, CTRI, that needs to be registered before you initiate the trial, before your patient is enrolled. So it is important that after the DCGI approval, after the ethics committee approval, you submit it on the CTRI, get it registered, and then only you initiate your trial sites, and they can start recruiting the trial patients or the participants, then start collecting the data as per your clinical trial protocol or the investigation plan, follow up the patients, collect data, analyze data. There are standards for data collection and data analysis as well. Follow those standards for doing that, and analyze the data, make it into a report, submit that report to the DCGI, and DCGI will again call for the subject expert committee meeting. They will review the data. Based on the recommendation, they will approve your drug product or your vaccine or your medical device. And then once you market it, you may have to give a post-marketing surveillance data for the device or for the drug in that case. So this is how the overall process is. There are certain rules that we have to follow, which is Clinical Trial Rules 2019, the new drugs and clinical trial rules of 2019, and the medical devices rules 2017, and there was an amendment to 2020. The amendment 2020 mentions that all devices will be considered as drugs now, so you will be treated, the devices are treated equivalent to that of a drug. And while these are regulations, there are guidelines that we have to follow. This is kind of the gold standard in terms of guidelines that we follow for clinical trials. What we say is the GCP, the Good Clinical Practices Guidelines. There's an international guideline by the ICH, and there's an Indian guideline as well. And we have to follow these GCP guidelines, when we do any clinical trial. Now I'm going to stop here and invite any questions or any comments that you all may have.
Okay.
Chirag, in the chat box, there are a couple of questions that have been asked. So
Okay.
if you can go through the chat box.
Yeah. I think we will take the question from chat box, but before that, we have one innovator or startup founder here who would like to ask you a couple of questions. Can I, Darshit, please unmute Bharadwaj.
Hello, Dr. Chirag.
Yeah, hi Bharat.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? Yeah. So I have a
Yeah,
couple
Bharadwaj,
of,
please go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. Firstly, for a pharma company, like how do they identify the patients for the clinical trials? Like you told the example of COVID-19 where patients were willing to participate in the trials, but consider the case of maybe some other disease, maybe a rare kind of cancer. How do the pharma company identify and convince or find out the patients who would be willing to participate in the trials? This is one question. And the second question is for a startup, especially like we are a AI software company, software healthcare company. So for us, how do we decide the class of the device, and how do we fast track this entire clinical trials and regulatory process? So these are my two questions.
Well, thank you, Bharadwaj. Both are great questions. For your first question, see, the pharma company, suppose if, and the example that you mentioned was of a rare cancer, let's say rare hepatic cancer. I'm just throwing up an example here. We find out, okay, there's a rare neuroendocrine tumor that we are finding a drug against it. So what we do is, as a pharma company, we go to the hospitals where they have those qualified expert doctors who treat such kind of patients. So and we look at the doctor's qualification, look at the doctor's expertise. We will visit the hospital to see do they have the facilities to conduct the clinical trial per that protocol that we have devised. Do they have all the radio diagnostics that we want, or the biomarkers, or so? Or can they send the patient's samples to a lab which is, say, suppose outside of India somewhere, etc., etc. There are a lot of things that we look at. So what we call as the site selection. So it's a very robust process that we do before selecting a site. We look at the qualifications of the team members also. We look at their experience. We look at their trainings and the patient population. So once we select the doctor, then we give adequate training to the doctor and his or her staff members as well. As I mentioned, it could be a nurse, could be a coordinator, could be a pharmacist, pathologist, whoever, I mean the phlebotomist, it could be anybody. So whoever are there, we train all of them. Now, the patient selection is not done by the pharma company. We never meet a patient. We just meet doctors and the staff. The patient selection is done by the doctors. Now, suppose if there's Dr. ABC in XYZ hospital, now the doctor has that patient pool. He sees those patients who have this rare neuroendocrine tumor in the liver. So then in that case, he will go through his databases. He will maybe connect with those patients and offer them the study which is there. Let's see, there's a trial which is coming up. In that case, do you wish you want to participate? And I'll tell you, there is a robust informed consent process that happens. Nobody can force a patient into a trial. The doctor, there's a detailed form which is given to these patients. It could be running into 10, 12, 15 pages. All the available information about that new investigational product is in that informed consent form. Suppose if it's a phase 3 trial, then all the available data for phase 1, phase 2, all of that is into that. The entire thing is explained to the patient, to the caregivers, whoever is with the patient. The form is given to the patient. The patient can take the form back home, discuss with the family, discuss with family physician, come back tomorrow, come back after a week as well, and he or she has the right to say, sorry, I don't want to participate. So it's a completely voluntary process. And then the doctor talks to the patient agrees, and then the patient gets into the study. There's a screening test that happens because of there are inclusion and exclusion criteria which determine the entry of the patients into the trial. They have to be of a particular disease and particular severity or whatever of a particular condition. So that has to be fulfilled. So they will undergo a screening test. If they pass all that, then they'll be randomized into the trial. And also to tell you, the patient can decide to withdraw at any point in time in the trial. If I say yes today, tomorrow I can withdraw after 3 months or even a year without jeopardizing my further treatment. So the doctor will continue to treat me outside of the trial. Sometimes I may be followed up for my data, because since I have taken the investigational product in a trial, there are some outcomes trial which are, say in this case it's a cancer. I want to look at the overall survival. So did I survive for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? That data will be collected, and that is where the patient may be called up to say, hey, are you okay, everything okay, etc. So that data will be collected. But otherwise the patient can choose to walk out of the trial anytime. So hope this answers your first question.
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Chirag. I think it was a very detailed explanation.
Yeah. Now to your second question, see the AI based, now what is it that you want to, if it's a device that you want to do it. Now again, if it's a category B, C or D device, you will need to do a clinical investigation in that case, and that is where you will need to submit your investigation plan to the DCGI and to the ethics committee to get their review and approval. So that definitely is going to be the case. So you see the rules are mentioning which kind of device will fall into A, B, C, D. So if it is A, generally they may not ask it, only specifics they may ask, but B, C, D, you will have to do a clinical investigation.
Okay, and these rules, how do we classify the device into different classes? These are mentioned in the website.
These are mentioned in the rules also, and also it is depending upon, if you see, it is depending upon the invasiveness of it. Like if you see, if it's a non-invasive medical device which comes into contact with an injured skin but not breaching the dermis, I mean there are layers of skin, as you know, the epidermis, dermis and all that. If it doesn't breach the dermis, then it is class A. But if it is used in breech, dermis, or connected with an active medical device, which is class B, C, A, D, then it will be classified as class B, or class C if it's kind of a blood bag or that modifies the biological chemical composition of blood or other body liquids also. So that's how they are classified there.
Okay. And last question about multi-centric clinical trials versus single hospital. So who decides this?
You
How
only
many-
decide as a sponsor. As a sponsor, you will decide whether you want to go to multi-centric clinical trials or not. In general, if you see, when we go to our DCGI, they expect data from different parts of India. There is diversity among different regions of India, so they expect that can you have the sites in north, east, west, south, everywhere. So that's what they expect because the patient population will cover the entire country. Now, from an operational perspective, see, sometimes what happens is, let's take the example of this rare cancer that you mentioned, rare neurocrine tumor that you want. Now that you may not get at one site, right? It may be in Kolkata, it may be in Hyderabad, it may be in Delhi, which is draining the patients from, say, even as high as Jammu and Kashmir and all that. People come there to look at a particular center in Delhi. So you will need to go to different centers. Otherwise, you will not get your targeted patient population numbers, and the trial duration may stretch. So you will have to do the feasibility. Of course, having more sites will also lead to an increase in the cost because maintaining each site will be costly. So you'll have to balance your cost vis-a-vis time, vis-a-vis the number that you are looking at. Say if it's only 10 patients you want for the total duration, then it's a difference to you can do it in one or two centers. But if you want 100 patients, imagine doing it only one or two centers, it will take a long time and they may not even have this patient population. So a lot of factors go into you selecting the sites, but it's you who will finally select. The regulators do recommend going pan-India or different regions of India.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Shiva.
Yeah,
My questions
so-
are answered.
Thanks, Bharadwaj. So, Dr. Trivedi, on the same line, what Bharadwaj asked you about the multicentric, how many places we should conduct the trials and all. So, is there any? I mean, the way you said, you will get suggestions, but of course, you have to decide based on everything, feasibility, cost, and. But is there any standard protocol or any guidelines such as that this many sites are required? Because we have one question in the chat box. I'll also take that question along with this. So it is a question from Kanchan Mana, who is asking that is it mandatory that one investigational site means it should be only one particular hospital or a healthcare center? So she has also given an example here that let's say if a doctor or a PI is consulting surgery visiting 3 different hospitals, so the same doctor but visiting 3 different sites or 3 different hospitals, so on. So will it be considered as a multi-centric thing?
So one center will be one hospital site. And I'll explain to you why am I saying that. See, if you see, first of all, there are no guidelines on how many centers you should have. There are guidelines on what are the qualifications of the investigator and the hospitals kind of hospital that you will need to have, which is in the GCP guidelines, responsibility of investigator. They have mentioned very clearly there. Now, if I'm a consultant surgeon visiting 3 hospitals, but if I'm doing trial at only one place, my site will be considered only at that place. I may have patients coming from the other 2 hospitals to this hospital. See, you have to keep the investigational product somewhere. You cannot keep it at all the 3 places, right? You have to have full accountability of the investigational product. There has to be specific storage conditions. This is investigational product. It cannot go into the hands of anybody. Anything can happen because there is not proven for safety and efficacy. That's why you need to keep the products very safely. It has to be in a secure environment, also per the temperature or the storage condition that you have defined. Second, there is data which is available. So the patient data needs to be available. Otherwise, how will you verify the data? What will the auditors and the inspectors do when they come for inspections? So we need to have data. So the data will be at that site. Whatever has to be done will be done. Now, sometimes there could be a satellite site that, okay, I will do this here. Patient consenting may be done at my personal clinic, say in that XYZ area, but my hospital is in PQR area. So I will do that here. You need to specify that upfront to the regulators, to the ethics committees also, because see, the facilities at both these places should be adequate and acceptable for conducting a clinical trial that you want to conduct. The regulators need to know this, the ethics committee need to know this, so there has to be, that's where, and as I mentioned earlier, the ethics committee will take responsibility of the other side as well. So all of these have to be put in place, and that's where you can have satellite sites, but you may have only one main site which is there. Define what is your hub and spoke model that you want to define, and oversight mechanism, governance mechanism, and then you can have different sites doing different parts of the activity. Sometimes what may happen, the patient records may be kept at the other side because you don't have space here. Define that. But otherwise, generally, people will do one hospital, one site. Hope this answers the question.
Okay. So Kanchanmala, if you have any further question on the same this thing, we will unmute you. You can raise your hand in case you have any further question. We have a lot of other questions as well, but there are one question which is I keep on getting from the this healthcare startups, medtech people who are working in the medtech segment. That how do we classify whether in which class it falls? I know you have explained it during your presentation, but if you can please give more details on it, because there are a lot of questions on that. So the classification and where should we go for a permission for clinical trials? There is always questions, CDSCO, ICMR, and you have already addressed it, but we have one question in the Q&A chat box. So if you can highlight that again.
Sure. I will let you know. See, the medical devices are classified mainly on the intended purpose of the device, how invasive they are, and how long will they be implanted. So there are three pillars basis for classification, if you see. So non-invasive medical devices that comes in contact, as I mentioned earlier, with the injured skin, but they will not breach the dermis, then they are in class A, which is the low risk category that we saw in the ABCD classification. But if it is going to breach the dermis or connect it with another active medical device, which is class B, C, or D, it is classified as class B or class C, or it is called class C in case if it's kind of a blood bag or that modifies the biological or a chemical composition of blood or any other body fluids or other liquids which are intended for infusing into the body. So like your saline or whatever, it could be along with it. If you are giving it, then you are giving it. It could be class C because it is how it is going to be introduced into the body. So invasive medical devices, again, now coming to the period of use for it, if it's an invasive medical device, then for transient use, which means less than suppose 60 minutes, will be called as class A. But if it's for the external surface or say on the eyeball or for the cavity or the pharynx or in the ear canal or so, then it is called as class B. So again, depending on where you want to use it, it will be on class A or class B. Now, let's see the other kind of examples here. So, if it's reusable, surgically invasive medical devices, again for a transient use, will be in class A. But if they are not reused, then they are class B or class C if they're intended for passing any ionizing radiation. So again, the classification will change. Again, a transient or a short-term use for surgically invasive medical device is assigned to class C if it's intended for an administration of any medicinal product by means of a delivery system. So there's a active medication there, and by a delivery system, then it comes into class C. Now a transient or a short term, which means for a continuous use for more than 60 minutes to 30 days. So this was the earlier was up to less than 60 minutes. Now this is from more than more than an hour to 30 days. Then the surgically invasive medical device is assigned to class D. So it becomes the highest risk category which we know of. And if it is intended to be used specifically in either direct contact with the central nervous system or for the diagnosis or monitoring or correction of a defect of the heart or for central circulatory system through direct contact. So these are all high risk categories which go into class D there. Again, another kind of which are surgically invasive medical device for short term will be assigned to class B. So there, if you see, like again, if they are for long term use, which is class C, long term use intended, which is beyond 30 days also, but it's a medical device which assigned to class B, lot of things. I mean, if it's placed onto the tooth. So that way, if you see, this is how the classifications happen. If it's assigned to class D, intended to be used in the direct contact with heart or the circulatory or the central nervous system, that's how it goes into a class D.
Okay.
Hope this helps.
Yeah. So one question on this before, I mean, we have other participants who have raised their hand, but before that, where can these participants find all this information? Because I keep on getting the question from the innovators saying that we are at early stage, we don't have a lot of money or funds available for this. Whom should we approach for this? Shall we, are there any consultancies, and how to go about it? Cost effective way.
So there are consultants also which are available who can guide you there. Of course, they will charge a fee, and you will need to negotiate fees with them. One of the simple ways, if I may say, is see, the CDSU, our DCGI office, has started a public relation officer, PRO, a few years ago. This is the place where exactly people like, I'm a new startup, I don't know much, but how do I go about it and all that. Maybe you can approach them, they will guide you. So there's a DCGI office, PRO, and approach that PRO cell, and they will give you information, they will guide you to the right people to get that information. Other mechanism that is available for us is there's a pre-submission meeting which is there in the rules now with the DCGI official. So it comes, I think, at uh, 1.5 lakhs or so. There's a fee for it, but you give that fee, you submit your dossier, take regulatory consultation of the pathway. It could be for your device registration, it could be for a clinical trial protocol, whatever it is. And there, the CDSU key officials who are for that respective division will be present in that meeting. The subject expert committee, the physician experts will be present in that meeting, and you will get guidance. So here they will provide guidance to you so that you are sure about your regulatory pathway. You are sure that if you follow that, and if the results are favorable of your trial, you are going to get your registration. So you can approach the PRO, through the pre-submission meeting. There's a short way. The pre-submission meetings come with the written recommendations as well, so it becomes binding on the DCGI as well, so that even if you go after a year or two, then you know that you have the recommendation which you have adhered to, so it becomes easier for you, and they will tell you the exact pathway. So I would recommend that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this information is very, very valuable for the people who are attending this thing and who wants to, go through this part. So I think, Darshit, can we unmute Rashmi here? Rashmi Shukla. She's also a startup founder named Kavach, and she has a couple of questions for you. Rashmi, can you hear me?
Maybe you have to unmute, Rashmi.
Rashmi, I think there is some technical issue. Darshit, can you please recheck? Okay, fine.
In the meantime, can you go back to? Can you go back to those people who have raised their hands?
Yes. So I think we have here. Okay, Rashmi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Pranita.
Yes, hi, Rashmi.
Hi, Rashmi.
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Chirag. My question is, how do, for any clinical trial or clinical investigation or a performance evaluation study, the budget is to be defined? What factors need to be considered when defining the budget? So what are the important considerations for this?
Good question again. See, there are various elements that go into making of a clinical trial budget. So you have to start right from the cost of your product, the investigational product. How many? So your protocol will define your cost. What are the number of patients required for it? What are the pathological or radiodiagnostic tests that you will need to do for it? Your submission fees to the regulators, your submission fees to the ethics committee will be there. The fee that you pay to the investigator side, because obviously it's a fee for service that you will be giving to them. They are going to do some work for you for trial, for collecting the data, and also that will be a part of it. You will need to store your investigational product somewhere, so that also will be a part of it. There'll be a lot of cost for data management, because there'll be a lot of data, as you can imagine, which will come through from different sites, even if it's 5 or 10 sites, but you'll get a lot of patient data, visits data at different intervals. So the patient is following up at 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months visits. There'll be data collected at each of these visits. There'll be a lot of data that will be done. So there'll be data management cost, which will be there. Then all your, suppose, important biomarkers or anything that you have, exploratory markers that you want to look at, all this cost also will have to be factored in, multiplied by the number of patients, number of visits, the number of times that these costs will be done. So that's going to be important for you.
Okay.
Then of course there will be some other fees as well for the regulatory submission, which I mentioned. For your archival fees, you'll have to mention. Also keep some budget for the SAE management. I mean, serious adverse event management and compensation, if any, because our clinical trial rules specify that if there's any injury that is caused to the trial participant because of the trial, we'll have to pay for medical management as well as a compensation which is defined per the law. So keep some budget for that as well, because that is per law we have to pay. So these are different elements under which you'll have to budget. If you're using a vendor, say like for your product storage or vendor for your translations, because you'll have to give the informed consent form into different languages. The patient needs to understand the local language, I mean, which he or she is comfortable with. So that translation vendor will be there. There'll be a vendor for data management in case if you're not doing it on your own. And there are various standards that need to be followed for the data management. So these are different cost elements that will drive the cost of your study.
Okay. Thank you for the for all the details. Can I have the liberty to ask one more question? Like, is there time?
Yeah, Rashmi, but quickly.
Sorry.
Quickly, we can have one
Yeah,
more
yeah.
question.
So, what are the challenges faced if there is a biomarker which is, say, there's an in vitro test which is based on a biomarker for which a study has not been done before in India? Like you had said, clinical trials in India have form a very small percentage for the all over world. So if I'm introducing a new biomarker test which has not been tested before in Indian population, what are the challenges? And if there is a mobile application involved, what kind of challenges would be there? That's the question.
You need to first of all validate the biomarker, because obviously,
I
and I
can't
presume
hear
that
you properly, sir.
okay, is it better now or is it still bad?
Yeah, I can hear now. Yeah.
Yeah. So see, the biomarker or your whatever app or whatever EPRO, what we call, or e-clinical outcomes assessment marker that you want to use, will have to be validated that it is serving the intended purpose. So that is where it's going to be very important that you validate that biomarker first. Or if you may validate it, it's an exploratory marker, you want to validate it in the trial itself. But you need to compare with some standard. And that is going to be most important, because the regulators will look at that. Suppose you are saying it a marker, but how do you know that the value is that and that itself is a good marker with some other thing or not? You need to compare, right? I mean, if it's a prognostic marker, say for a heart disease, you need to compare with the existing markers to say, okay, with this is the accuracy or whatever. So all those validation parameters will need to be built in. And same is the case for even a mobile app as well. If the mobile app, I mean, what we call is, it's a part of our e-clinical outcomes assessment. So if it's an outcomes, it's going to be determined by that mobile app. You need to validate the functioning of that mobile app. And there are various, again, standards which are there for any electronic device that we use it. And that needs to be followed, because nobody should be able to tamper with the data. Nobody will be able to delete the data, etc., etc. Nobody will be able to change it, because otherwise your data will keep changing and you will not get accurate data. So follow those standards, and that will need to be done.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rashmi. Darshad, can we unmute Rahul Chaudhary? He is raising his hand for a long time. Rahul, can you hear us? Yeah, Rahul, please go ahead with your question. Rahul, you can go ahead with your question. We have unmuted you. Probably there is some technical issue. We have another hand raised by Mr. Venkatesh. Mr. Venkatesh Paddi. Okay. So meanwhile, while we are unmuting Mr. Venkatesh, we can get another question. We can have another question. Okay, Rahul is having some issues with his mic, so I'll take his question separately. So I'm unable to find your question, Rahul. But
the question is how to evaluate adverse event, right?
Yeah, Rahul.
I just read it.
Yeah. What are the standards we need to follow for a cancer treatment device, such as hypothermia device, which uses microwaves? That's a question from Rahul. So, Dr.
There's
Trivedi, would
two
you like
questions
to
from
ask?
Rahul, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is for the device which is using thermic, what was that? Microwave radiations.
Yes. I'll read that again for you. I was searching for Rahul's another questions. There's so many.
What are the standards we need to follow for a cancer treatment device, such as hypothermia device, which uses microwaves?
Okay. So when you say standards, mean is it for manufacturing or clinical trials? Manufacturing, I'm not the expert, but there are standards which are laid down anyway in the rules. You can look at that. But for clinical trial, it's the same standard that you would use for any clinical trial. I mean, if your devices, you need to have a lot of data for your device, say from your pilot study. If you've not done a pilot study, if there's no data available, if it's not marketed anywhere in the world also, you will need to generate a pilot study first. Pilot study means what we typically, if I may compare it, it is going to be the first in human studies or the phase 0 or phase 1 study, we would say. So you will need to generate data on that, basis which you will have to, from the safety of it, from the performance of that device, you'll have to devise your pivotal clinical intervention, and basis that standard which are there, you'll have to follow. So the standards don't change, but the information coming from a pilot will help you drive your design of the pivotal study. Hope this helps.
So there is one question. I think Rahul got the answer. There's one question in the chat box from Ishan. We are making a wearable ECG monitoring device. Do we need to comply to IEC and ISO standards to sell the product in Indian market?
I'm not sure if I'm the expert in that manufacturing standard, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to give the right answer. But from what I understand, from what I know a bit, is we have to follow. I think BIS standards is what is being defined in the rules. We need to follow that. But again, you need to confirm this. I'm not an expert in manufacturing, so those standards you'll have to look at the rules there.
Okay, so there is one question from one of the BIG grantee who is just starting their work with the biotechnology ignition grant. So she's a startup founder, Harshini. She's asking that how to classify the secondary medical device which supports other medical devices which may fall under class C, moderate to high risk. So how to classify this secondary medical device?
Again, as I mentioned, see, bunching of medical devices can happen. In this case here, this is there. So in this case also, if it's a second medical device, if it's used along with other medical devices class B, C or D, it is classified, will be B in that case then, because if it is breaching dermis, going into the inside the body or so, then it will be classified that way, at least as class B then in that case. Or if it's a blood bag or any of the fluids which needs to be given with the fluid into the body as an infusion, it will be a class C.
Okay. We have one more question. Is around, is DCGI approval a prerequisite for a class A medical device for a clinical study approved by hospital ethics committee? So this DCGI approval is a prerequisite?
So any clinical trial will have to be approved by DCGI, any clinical trial. And without that approval, you cannot start any clinical trial. And along with it, you also need the ethics committee approval. Now, if you have an academic clinical trial, so academic clinical trial means a hospital has initiated that trial on their own, and the data generated from that clinical trial will not be submitted to DCGI for any marketing authorization purposes, which this is what we call as an academic trial, then such academic trials may not require DCGI permission. Just the ethics committee approval may be sufficient in such cases. So what happens in this case is you submit your ethics committee, the ethics committee will evaluate it, and if they feel yes, this is okay to go ahead, they will submit it to the when they will give their approval, you can initiate. But if they are not sure, that it's kind of on the fence whether DCGI approval will be required or not, they may submit it to the DCGI, and then DCGI will come back to them within a stipulated timeline whether it should be within their purview or not. So academic clinical trials usually will not require any DCGI approval, provided they are not used for any marketing authorization purposes, and no data will be submitted to DCGI from that.
Okay. So we have one question from Siddharth. Actually, he's asking again. I'm coming. My question is again about classification. Under new classification, dental implants falls under which category? Dental implants.
I think it will come under B or C probably. Again, depending on the use that you have, that's how it is. But you may want to refer that document which will give you clarity, because I may not remember all the classifications for all the products. So best is that you refer to the rules for your classification.
Okay, okay. So I think we can take next question. I would also like to say, if any participants have any questions which are still in the Q&A box, but they would like to interact with Dr. Trivedi, please raise your hand. We will unmute you. Now, Jeffin is asking how to get the approval from ethics committee to conduct clinical trials. If you could, I think this is this question is from Jeffin. Can you please
Can you
answer?
repeat the question? Can you please repeat the question?
How to get the approval from ethics committee to conduct the clinical trials?
Okay, so the dossier that you submit to your to the DCGI for your approval, a similar dossier is submitted to the ethics committee also. Each ethics committees have their own SOPs, standard operating procedures, which will define what kind of documents they want. So you submit all those documents to the ethics committee. The additional document that you don't submit to DCGI but you submit to ethics committee is your translated versions of your informed consent forms, of your say clinical outcome assessment, or any e-patient reported outcomes, I mean, that you are collecting from the patient. All the translated versions need to be approved by the ethics committee as well. Any patient facing material needs to be approved by the ethics committee. Say like you are having an advertisement which you want to put it up on your hospital for advertising about your clinical trial so that patients read it and come. So that also needs to be approved by the ethics committee. So your standard thing of your clinical protocol, the case report form, the investigator's brochure, the undertaking, the agreement, all those things will be there. And in addition, there are these things which will also be there. So you will need to refer to the ethics committee SOP. It may differ from site to site, I mean hospital to hospital, and you will need to adhere to that.
Hope Jeffin, this will help you. There is one hand raised again by Mr. Venkatesh Vadde, if we can unmute him, Dashrath. Mr. Venkatesh Vadde.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Chirag, we are a startup and developing a medical device to monitor biometric parameters. And my question is, if you have a device which is useful to the pharma industry and the CROs both, what would be your advice on how to find sponsors for clinically testing such a device?
So you will need to present the data to the pharma or the CROs, the value proposition that your medical device brings in. How will that help? Say in terms of better diagnosis, faster diagnosis, saves time, whatever. So your value proposition is what needs to be given to them. If it matches with the strategic fitment of a pharma or a CRO of what they are looking at, then in that case they can take your device for their clinical trials.
Great. Would you happen to know any such examples, Dr. Chirag?
There are various companies over. I mean, I don't want to name any company, otherwise it will be I'm advertising for certain companies also. But you can always look at the product portfolio that some of these companies have, and the utility of your device in those therapeutic areas of interest that these people may have, and probably.
Yeah.
And Mr. Parthasarathy Phonguri could be the best person that you could go to. Sorry, Partha, I'm putting you on a spot, but.
Thank you, Dr. Chirag.
Yeah, I'm used to it. You did it in Sanofi, and now these people are doing it in Sign.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Venkatesh. Yeah, thank you so much. There's one question. Yeah, Partha, sir.
Yeah, there is another hand raised. So can you?
Yes. So while Dashrath is doing that, there's one more question in the chat box. How much time does it take to get the approval from DCGI and CTR when should we submit the documentation? But along with that, I have one question, Dr. Trivedi, maybe on the similar line, that these innovator startups, most of the time they concentrate on developing their products, and then when they're almost ready, they think about now going to validation or clinical trials. So, and then later that takes too much of time. So when should they start planning, or at least, designing something about this?
So again, this is a great set of questions here. Planning is the key in everything that we do, right? So even in your product development, be it a medical device or drug product, whatever, planning is going to be the key, and you have to start way in advance. So if you remember some of those charts that I had shown, progressive phases from preclinical discovery to preclinical to clinical, you know where you're going to end, and you have to end your preclinical phase and start your clinical phase. So obviously before that, you need to start planning it. Now, DCGI has said it will give you the review and approval within 90 days. So that's the timeline. But you need to have a protocol in place for that. You need to have the other paraphernalia which is required, your information of the product, which is what we call it as the investigator's brochure. That will be there. You need to have a case report form. You will have the informed consent form. So to prepare all these documents also take time. You need to have a lot of review processes internally within your own company to make sure that these documents are kind of foolproof, so that they will pass the muster of the regulators or the ethics committees. So all that will take time, and you need to start way in advance. You need to select your hospital sites. See, the details of your hospital sites need to be submitted to DCGI. So you have to do your site selection. Say if you're going to select, say, 5 sites, you need to select those 5 sites. There are undertakings which are need to be given from those sites to the DCGI. So all that data collection also will take time. Site selection will take time. So start early. When you know that, suppose if your product is ready to be going into a phase 1, say in June 2021, start working backwards. So retro planning will help you to say, okay, I need at least 4 months for DCGI submission and approval. I need at least 3 months for one ethics committee approval. If I do it in parallel, it will be 3 months. It could be on the higher side. I'm just saying it so that it will take time, and that's how you do your retro planning.
To add to Dr. Chirag submission, what I would request you to do is that whatever work you do, you please capture all that preliminary data and other things. It will come in handy when you are submitting it to DCGI. And when you are going to develop a prototype, maybe 3-4 months before that, you start looking out or assembling those documents whichever are needed, and that should by the time you develop the prototype, then every other document is ready, and you can immediately submit it to the DCGI or CDSCO as the case may be, and get an early approval. And the timelines given are broad timelines. Don't question me or Chirag Trivedi, Nisha, why it has not been done in 90 days. 90 days is a broad timeline.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Partha sir.
Thank you, Partha sir.
Yeah. So can we unmute Ayan here, please? Yeah, Ayan, please go ahead with your question. Ayan, can you please go ahead with your question? You're on. Okay, I think there's some question, but Ayan has actually posted his question in the chat box. How can a device? Can we?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Trivedi. So I have a question. We are a startup from IIT Kharagpur. Basically, we are dealing with devices, biomedical devices, which are of transdermal nature. So we have a pool of clinical trial data. Preclinical trial data, conducted in the animal facility here in Kharagpur. So my question is that what is the amount of data, preclinical data required, so that we can apply for a clinical trial? That is the question.
If you see, there is in the medical rules that we spoke about, there is data available for your preclinical. What all things you need to submit? They have given a detailed list of the data that is required for preclinical that you need to submit for getting your pilot study approval. So there you can refer to that, and you should be able to get that data.
Okay. Fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks,
I mean, there's
Ayan.
a big list up there. That's why I'm not giving that. There's a big list.
Okay.
Because they're looking at design inputs which are there. There are in vitro tests which you need to have, reliability test, mechanical,
Fine.
electrical validation, etc. So there's
Is
a
there any
long list of.
website? Is there any
Yeah.
website
So
to check?
if you see the Indian Medical Rules 2017, you will get all that data in that. So if in
Okay.
any of these search engines, just type Medical Device Rules 2017 in India, you will get it.
Fine. Thank you.
The
Thank you so
document, you
much.
should get the document. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks, Ayan.
Yeah.
There is one question in the chat box, Dr. Trivedi. Is approval from Bharat Patil, is approval depends on only on safety of a new drug device or trade-off of safety versus benefit of the new drug or device? And he has another question for in vitro diagnostic device, whether where there is no direct risk to the patient, what are the criteria for approval? So one is about the drug and the other one is the device.
So coming to your first question, again, a good question here. Let me tell you, there's always a benefit risk analysis which will be done continuously. Nobody will be able to give you, say, if there is a drug which will kill 30%. Imagine, I mean, just let's take the vaccine, COVID vaccine example again. Vaccine candidates which were approved caused deaths. Would it be approved? Because this is going to be given to billions of people across the world. So there will be no trade-off. Safety remains paramount. Efficacy, if you see for vaccine, they are defined at least 50% benchmark was there. That if it crosses 50%, that will be called as efficacious. That's how it will be allowed for approval. So there will be no trade-off. Benefit risk analysis is done continuously before your approval, I mean during the trial, and even after it is approved. If it is in the market, introduced to people or patients, the benefit risk ratio continues till the life cycle of the product. Sorry, Pranita, you are on mute.
Sorry. So I think this might have answered Bharat's question, but in case you have any more question, Bharat, please, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. There is one question in the chat box from Kushal. I think it'll be better if he can ask this question. So Dashrath, can we unmute him, please? Yeah, Kushal, you can go ahead with your question.
He's still muted.
Okay, I think there is some issue then. However, I'll ask question in between. If we can unmute Kushal, he'll just jump in. So we have developed, Kushal is asking that we have developed a non-invasive polymer-based orthopedic support device that will be used in place of conventional plaster fiberglass cast, braces and splints. I could not find a lot of relevant Indian legal literature on the internet about cast and orthopedic support devices. So how should I classify this device? If it is classified as class A device, are there any pre-market regulatory prerequisites I should take care of? Shall I repeat the question again, Dr. Trivedi?
No, understood. See, it could be now again. You will need to look at from the website the classification data. It could be probably if it's a non-invasive thing, if it's not going beyond the dermis, and if it's not going to be used along with any other devices, also probably could be a class A. But again, I would suggest maybe check with the PRO there in the DCGI's office, and they'll be able to guide you with the exact classification.
Adding on to what Chirag has said, the startup doesn't get to classify a device. It is the regulator who classifies the device. I may think
Correct.
anything. I may think even a mitral valve is a class A device, but it is the DCGI, the CDSCO, who has to classify it. My classification does not have any meaning.
True.
So, thank you, Partha sir. Thank you. So we have one more hand raised, Shruti. Can we please unmute her? But before, while doing that, we have one question from Madhu Gupta. She is a faculty and she has designed a formulation that is very useful for diabetic foot ulcer. I have, this faculty member has preclinical data. So she would like to know that how much time it will take for other studies. We are other studies in like for preclinical or the question is not really clear. If you want to, yeah.
In general, a clinical trial development, the phase 1, 2, 3, may take anywhere, the total, all the three phases I'm saying about will take anywhere between 4 to 6 years, depending again on the design or the intent of your study. Some studies are there with you have 2 years or 3 years of follow-up. They will be longer. Diabetic foot ulcer, probably we'll have to see how long you want to follow the patient for. If it was pure diabetes, you say, okay, after 6 months, the control is there. The study ends for each patient after 6 months. But if it's a foot ulcer, it may go a bit longer. We'll have to see. Or a shorter one, again, depending on the indication that you have to study. But generally, it will take anywhere between 4 to 6 years to complete all the three phases, analyze data, and get it. Vaccine development was a very different thing where they did all the data analysis and all together. There was an army of people doing all the things simultaneously. So that may not be the right example in terms of timelines.
Okay.
This helps. Yeah.
This is Dr. Shruti Acharya. We are a startup based out of Manipal, Government of Karnataka Bioincubator, sir. So we are dentists who are working on a prototype which is going to help to take dental x-rays without errors. And it is, so as far as we have read the MDR definitions, it does not follow under the definition per se, sir. So we want to believe that ours is a product and not a device. So we would require an NOC from CDSCO, sir. So how exactly do we need to go about it? Right now we are in the phase of, we are doing a pilot study phase. We have applied to ethics committee and we have got a meeting scheduled next week, sir.
So once your data of your preclinical studies, pilot studies available, you said it's a drug product. It's not a device, right? That's what you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a device. It's a prototype. It's going to take help to take dental X-rays without errors, sir. And it's going to come outside the mouth. So it's a product and not a device, as per the definition of MDR, sir.
Okay. But so in that case, you may you just submit data, preclinical data regulators, and they will take around 90 days to review it.
Okay. I want we right now will have probably the pilot study data. Do we need to have the validation study data also? We need to share both the data with them, sir?
Yes. In the MDR rules, they have specified which kind of data is required when you submit which kind of application. So you will require it.
So to get the NOC also, we need to share this, right, sir?
Yeah, because see, the evaluating person at the CDSCO or the subject expert committee will need to look at all the data, right?
Right. So then there's something like, they do not fall under the registered list, sir. So still we need to follow these steps, right?
It's an investigational product, right?
Right.
So you will need to follow that, and it's an investigation. So yeah, please, you'll have to follow that.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shruti.
Chirag, there is a question. Can you please highlight about pharmacovigilance? I hope he means PV is pharmacovigilance and not some other terminology which he is using. Rajiv Mehta.
Okay. So again, pharmacovigilance plays a very important role throughout the development process, be it a drug or a product or a device, whatever. And also after that. So pharmacovigilance is the key. As we discussed a while ago, benefit risk ratio will be done basis the reports that come in. Any adverse event that occurs during a clinical trial. What is an adverse event? Any untoward medical occurrence. Say if I'm in a trial and I have a dog bite. Now dog bite is an untoward medical occurrence that needs to be reported. I am walking down the stairs and I have a fall. Now that's an untoward medical occurrence that also needs to be reported in a clinical trial. So these are adverse events that gets collected. They get analyzed whether it was because of the clinical trial, because of the drug product or not. I mean, if I'm walking down on the stairs, very likely that it is not related to clinical trial. I missed a step and I fell down because of that. So that's how it's going to be. So it's unrelated. Or if I'm having a dog bite, it's not because of the clinical trial, right? So that way the relatedness is determined, but every data gets collected. So in a clinical trial, whatever happens to a patient, we need to collect all the data, also follow up the patient till the resolution of that adverse event. So if it takes 1 month, if it takes 2 months, whatever it takes to resolve, we will follow the patient for that data, because we need to know the resolution of that data. Now, suppose in clinical trials, usually we don't have pregnant women because we don't know the impact of the investigational product during pregnancy, or to the fetus, or to the child that will be born tomorrow. We don't know that, right? So we don't take it. If during a trial, if the participant gets pregnant, or the wife of a male participant gets pregnant, we would follow up the pregnancy till the outcome to see if there was any impact of that investigational product onto the fetus or the child that was born. So the drug product, the investigational product is stopped immediately the moment it is known that the woman, the participant has got pregnant, or the wife of the participant has got pregnant. The investigational product is immediately stopped, but the follow-up of the pregnancy happens till the outcome, so that we follow. Now, this is for a clinical trial. All adverse events, serious adverse events, need to be reported, collected, analyzed, and sent to DCGI, to the ethics committee, and to the hospital as well. So there are rules governing that. Once the product is marketed, now post-marketing surveillance again is defined in the law. You have to submit periodic safety update reports. So for the first 2 years, it's every 6 monthly, and then for the next 2 years, it's annual. And if the regulators deem fit, they may want to extend the periodic safety update report period as well. Any new SUSAR, what we call suspected unexpected adverse reaction, happens during the post-marketing phase, that needs to be reported within 15 days to the DCGI's office. So there are rules which are being laid, and there is a robust safety monitoring mechanism which is put in place. I hope this answers your question.
Chirag, there is another question. What's the difference between preclinical trials and proof of concept trial?
So preclinical, as the word says, is before clinical. Clinical means you do in the humans, in the clinic. Clinic means it could be a hospital, but it's a clinical phase, means in humans. Preclinical means anything done before what you try in humans is what is preclinical. So that is how it is distinguished between clinical and preclinical.
And POC, proof of concept.
Proof of concept is a study, say, let's say I'm working on an hypertension, anti-hypertensive medication. Now, I've done my phase 1. I've done proven that it's a novel mechanism. It really controls, brings down the blood pressure by, say, 20 millimeters of mercury. I know Partha will jump off the seat that how can a drug do that? I'm just throwing up an example here, that it reduces by 20 millimeters of mercury in my animal models. I want to check that. You do the phase 1, prove that it is safe, there's no toxicity concern for the participants. You go to phase 2. You take your hypertensive patients, you check into them and see whether it really brings down the blood pressure or not. And that is what we call as POC, the proof of concept, because you have a concept, you have to prove that concept, and that's why those POCs are. So this is what a POC will be.
Okay. In the case
does
of
it bring
devices,
about intended effect? That's what a POC is. Does it bring about the intended effect? Sorry, Partha.
In the case of devices, a device that can be used in human beings, what is the proof of concept there, and what is the preclinical trial there? In the case of devices.
See, the preclinical trial will be all those tests that we spoke about, right? The preclinical list which I narrated some time ago, like the in vitro test, mechanical test, all those. So that's a preclinical thing. That's a data that you have to generate for your device there, your biological safety evaluation, etc., etc. So that's a preclinical thing there. In terms of your medical devices, you'll have to do a pilot study first to see if it's a phase 0, phase 1 study, what we call as in parallel in the drug phase. You have to do that study first to see if it really works or not, performance of the device that you want, intended use of the device, gather data from it, and then do a larger phase 2 or a phase 3 study. So that's how you transition for a medical device.
Can I have one question on this line? Is that we have received one question during registration as well as and one question in the Q&A box. So any formula for fixing sample size like pilot study, any number from 10 to 100 subject is fine, and how to justify that to ethical committee. But one more question, additional question from my side is that so all these people have questions regarding pivotal studies, pilot studies, how many patients are like sufficient. But one more thing is that there is one concept of like tapestry pooling, and during COVID times some work has been done in even IIT Bombay, that COVID sample patient testing, how can we do that tapestry pooling and all. Is there any regulation around it for the tapestry pooling? And again, related to this, how many patients sufficient for this?
So, first of all, for your pilot study, say in case of devices, usually you may take say between 20 to 30 volunteers. There is no guidance or there's no fixed number which is given. Generally, these statistical, the sample sizes are driven by statistics. And what I mean by statistics, by data. The available data will drive your sample size. In a pilot study, obviously it's a first in human study, you have no data available, so you try on a smaller number, which is say 20, 25, 30, or that kind of a number that you try on, and then that generates data. That will help you determine what is the effect size that you wanted to look at. That effect size, what is it observed in the pilot study? Was the intended effect size observed? Say if it is X amount of whatever units or whatever your therapy area that you're looking at or intended use of your device, is it giving this? So if that is the case, then that effect size will help you determine your sample size. So it has to be a statistically justified, statistically significant sample size calculation, which is what will drive your clinical investigation protocol. And this sample size will come from the data that you have generated from a prior. So that's how your sample size is being calculated.
Chirag, if I may ask you here, has it got anything to do with power of the study?
Yes, good point, Partha. So the power means the strength of your result that you'll observe. In general, people expect at least the power of the study should be 80%. 90 better, 95 still better. But the more the power you want, the more maybe the sample size, because you want to prove like you are 80 times out of 100 times you will get this result. What it means in short. I'm not a biostatistician expert, but from what I understand, this is how it is. Similarly, if you go to 90% power, 95%, that means 95 times out of 100 times you will need more data to prove that. So the more power you have, more will be your sample size, more will be your cost as well, because you have to have so many more patients which will be recruited in that. But if you want to go all out and you want to prove that yes, my study is having 90% power and my product is really, really very good, so be it. You can go ahead with 90% power. But minimum 80 is required. So good point, Partha. Thank you for bringing it up.
I think
there is another question there. Sorry, Pranita.
Okay.
Is there any particular period of time for conducting the phase 1, 2, 3 trials?
There's no period of time. See, you will need to conduct it as quick as possible, because you need to obviously get the product ahead in the different phases and get it to the market, right? So the faster you do it, the better it is for you. There's no defined timeline as well. You need to make sure that your study is designed in such a manner that all the necessary data gets collected, your volunteers that you require for a phase 1 study are recruited, etc., etc. So there is a lot of feasibility that you need to do first and then determine the timelines, but there is no set timeline. I mean, faster the better.
I think Dr. Trivedi and Partha sir, we are towards the end of the session, the time. I would like to have a quick comments from both of you, since you are in this area working so many years. A last comment, suggestions for our participant from both of you.
Partha sir, you want to go first?
No, let me come towards the end. The guy who pulls the plug.
Okay. So my suggestion to you all will be, know the rules, know the requirements well, so that whenever you are progressing ahead with your product development, you don't face hurdles there. Otherwise, you do certain things, the regulations require something else, it will be very different. Also, my earnest request to each one of you is, let's not cut any corners anywhere. All our products eventually will be used by humans. So any quality defect will be detrimental to humans. Any ethical compromise will be detrimental to humans. So whichever field you are in, I mean, whether it's prosthesis, whether it's heart implants, whether it's IVDs, whatever you want to do, make sure that you follow the quality parameters required. We should stand for it. All of you all stand for India. All of you all stand for the quality that India brings on the table. And I would really, really urge you all to keep that quality flag, the ethics flag flying high. Success will follow. That's it, what I want to say.
Yeah, from my side, a couple of points. Friends, from whichever incubator you are, there is a person in your incubator who is familiar with these regulatory things. So first approach that person and then later approach CDSCO or DCGI, because you have enough and more qualified people to answer these questions in your incubator. Unfortunately, we do not make use of them. Right? That is the first thing which I want to say. Second thing, the common impression about any government organization is that they are lackadaisical and they take a lot of time. But for me, my experience is that both CDSCO as well as DCGI, they are highly committed to startups and they deal with startups in a separate fashion and they are highly responsive. That's the second point which I want to convey. Third thing, those of you who are in this western part of India, you have a DCGI outpost in Venture Center Pune. There is a regulator there sitting there. So you can always approach this person and he has been very, very helpful. At least IIT startups have significantly benefited from this person. Even if you are from south of India, there is no harm in approaching this person, right? So that is another thing which I want to convey. And those of you who are into academics, who are doing either their PhD, postdoc, or who are professors and assistant professors, please start with investigator-initiated trial, IIT. That would save a lot of time and regulatory headache. Start your product as an start your whole work as an investigator-initiated trial, and that's an easy way to, speed up the regulatory process. And this is all I have to share. And I thank Poini ma'am for giving me this opportunity to be with you and address all you people.
Okay, thank you, Partha. I mean, towards the end, before we conclude this session, there are 2-3 major announcements from science side, which I'll do first, and then, of course, we have to thank our today's speaker for such an informative session. So, first of all, this particular, even BIRAC is conducting a regular sessions with one-on-one with individuals, with startups, innovators, to sort their queries related to clinical trials and all. In case you want to get in touch with these people, do write to us. We will guide you on the same. The other thing is that BIRAC also has various funding opportunity for clinical trials regulatory. One such program is Biotechnology Industry Partnership Program. The program also called as a BIPP. So you can approach BIRAC for this particular program if you are in that phase where you are going to conduct soon clinical trials or regulatory work and all that. So funds are available for supporting such activities from BIRAC side. Another major announcement from science side is that regarding biotechnology ignition grant, because I see some of the names here who are applying for biotechnology ignition grant or applied in last cycle, who are almost in the last phase of screening round. So these people, there is one announcement is that biotechnology ignition grant, the call for the BIG 18 has been extended till 15th March. So the call is not closing on 15th February, but it is extended till 15th March. So you still have sufficient time. And the reason for saying this is that in this application, particularly BIG application, there are sections related to such regulatory clinical trials or clinical work. All these sections, you need to fill these sections. So please use this information which was given by Dr. Chirag Trivedi in this session to fill these sections in your BIG application and strengthen your application. This is a funding, a very it's a biotechnology ignition grant is a flagship program of BIRAC, and it's a early stage funding for startups, innovators who are at just about to develop their product or before the POC. I'll say they have some proof of principle work. Then it is a good opportunity to support your work, because there is a funding of 50 lakhs, which will take you till the POC, that is proof of concept. Post that you can go for validation, preclinical studies, clinical studies based on your work. So please use this opportunity, and for more information, please do write to us on sign_big@signiitb.org. I have already posted this email addresses in the chat box. We will also have interactive session where we can have one-on-one, or we can also have one-on-one session with you. If you need any mentoring for writing these applications or addressing any of these sections, you can get in touch with us, and we will be happy to help you in that. So this is this is about the BIRAC funding schemes which will help you in your work. And towards the end of the session, I would like to thank our speaker, today's speaker, Dr. Chirag Trivedi, for patiently answering all the questions from the participants, for giving us so much information about clinical trials, regulatory around it. And of course, Partha sir, not only just for your inputs in this session, but for also helping us to organize this particular event or session with Dr. Chirag Trivedi. Thank you, both of you.
And the last word from the CEO of Sign.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I would also like to thank our participant for the active interaction with our speaker.
Yeah.
Over to you, ma'am.
No, so I think you have already concluded. Once again, I repeat my thanks to Dr. Chirag and Partha. You are a great facilitator and also prompter. So yeah, really appreciate being here. And all the participants, it's really, good to see your interactive session. Chat box is constantly buzzing and then coming on mic and then talking to them. Do keep, our team is here. They have shared their email ID and all those things. So do feel free to ping any point of time. Yeah. So
Chirag,
thank you once again.
Sorry,
yeah.
madam. Chirag, before
No,
you leave, can you flash your mail ID, please, so that any participant, if they want to contact you, they can. Yeah.
So Partha, we can actually do that. All the registered participants, in any case, we are going to send a follow-up message. We will share his email ID.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
Chirag.
you for this
Thanks once
opportunity.
again.
I enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Me too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.